All right, so these verses are some of the hardest in the Bible, and it's on sexual purity, and this is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. So, Ryan, if you'll throw the slide up, I just want to put a disclaimer up. There you go. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the demotivation posters, but this is the way I think of myself. I'm serving as an example to others out of experience. What you're going to hear today is probably not a lot of great theology, but it is experience. It is hard-won scars, and hopefully an object lesson for you guys to not make the same mistakes that I have made, and also to learn about a topic. So if we can go on to the next slide, there you go. Thanks, guys. We're going to get into the topic a little bit about sexual purity, and we're going to talk about those verses in 1 Corinthians. The very first thing that I want to kind of start with, and we've talked about Corinthians a lot, we're at chapter 6, the end of chapter 6. A couple things that I want you guys to keep in mind. One, Paul's writing to Christians. He's not talking about sexual sin to the culture, and he's not talking about temptation. He's talking about actual committed sin. Christians committing sin. That's a sobering, really scary thought. Secondly, we've kind of talked a lot about how Corinthians, the city of Corinth, was Sin City of its time. I fell down a rabbit hole researching this, and it was kind of interesting. One of the things that I came across said that probably Corinth wasn't any worse than any other large city in the Roman Empire. They all had temples, they had prostitutes, they had other forms of sin. But I thought something that was really important that this person said in the article, one of the things that we need to remember is the fact that chances are the Christians of the Corinthian church were more wealthy and had more free time than almost any other of the early churches because of their relative wealth. Sexual sin is a luxury sin. It is an availability sin. And I think it's really important for us to remember this because we have in our own world right now, in our culture, a tremendous amount of relative luxury. We're not spending our times, by and large, gathering food, growing food, worried about war. So we have time to get into things. We also have a tremendous amount of availability. So we're going to talk a little bit about a few statistics that I think are really, really important. So Ryan, let's go into the statistics. Now, I'm a little bit more interactive. I want somebody to be willing to speak just like I am, but to stand up and read Proverbs 6:27 through 29. We're going to prove who has actually got their Bibles open. I will actually wait. So Proverbs 6:27, 28, 29. Somebody got it? Stand.
27, 29?
27, 28, and 29. Proverbs 6.
Can a man embrace fire and his clothes not be burned? Can a man walk on burning coals without scorching his feet? So it is with the one who sleeps with another man's wife, no one who touches her will go unpunished.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Think about that for a second. Again, Proverbs, wisdom. So let's actually just look at some stats. 85, and these are conservative, by the way. These are not very loose estimates. 85% of young men between the ages of 14 and 18 have been involved with porn. It's about 100 adults in the room right now. 57% of young women, 14 to 18. And now they're saying that pornography is accessed regularly as early as age 6, 7, and 8. Just let that percolate a little bit. I do counseling and discipleship, trying to pay forward to the amazing grace that God's given me on this subject, and I've now done it for over a decade. You know, I stood in a room after I had blown my family and marriage apart, and a group of godly people came around, held on to my wife and I, and then walked through nuclear levels of fire for years. So I know from personal experience, but I also want to share a couple other experiences. I was meeting with a young man last summer. He had been married for about a year. Early 20s, out of school, him and his wife, everything Christian, both raised in Christian homes. And his wife caught him using pornography for the second time in a few months. And it petrified him. It scared him to death because he didn't know why. He knew what had happened, and protection as they could potentially have today. But still, imagine that you're 11 years old, you're interested, it's illicit, it came to your email, nobody's around, I'm using a computer that the school gave me on a school email account, sitting in the kitchen by myself, click. And he said that's where it started. So, if I ask you guys, everybody take out their phones, right now, everybody take out their phones. Unlock them, and go open your browser history. Hand your phone to the person next to you. No, I'm joking. But to see the number of panicked eyes that I just saw, seriously think about that. Could you show your browser history from your phone to somebody else right now? The math tells us that in that fourth statistic, 24 to 40% of all married men and 20 to 25% of all American married women will have an affair during their lives. There's not a single person in this room that hasn't been affected by sexual sin. It's mathematically impossible. Whether it led to a divorce, whether it led to a problem, whether it was pornography, not a single person in this room. Think about that for a second. What do we do with that information? What does that mean? Paul was talking to Christians. Now, one of the things, again, because I'm an information person, I fell down the rabbit hole, is it's interesting to see the secular world catching up to what Paul knew, 2,000 years ago. And I found a study that said that viewing sexually illicit material or pornography or engaging in illicit activity has the same dopamine reactions as a drug addiction. The same exact response, the same brain response. And interestingly enough, and I have the article link if somebody wants to look at it later, is that, and this is in the second paragraph, the compelling finding in the study is that compulsive porn consumers find themselves wanting and needing more porn, even though they don't necessarily like it. That sounds like an addiction. This disconnect between wanting and liking is a hallmark of the reward circuitry being rewired in your brain. You are actually physically rewiring your brain. Something else that somebody said in a different article, and I'm going to read this one verbatim, so sorry. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter and a hormone that is a key part of your brain's reward system. When someone compulsively views pornography, dopamine is continually released into your brain, which can lead to neuroplastic changes, which means your brain physically changes. The brain may also begin to recognize pornography as something important for survival, which can make it difficult for someone to stop seeking out the stimulus. This can lead to behaviors like spending a lot of time thinking and obtaining and maintaining pornography. Porn scenes, like addictive substances, are hyper-stimulating triggers that lead to unnaturally high levels of dopamine secretion. This can damage the dopamine reward system and leave it unresponsive to normal sources of pleasure. You're physically rewiring your brain when you do this. And I fell down this rabbit hole because I found it pretty interesting that Paul makes a reference to food. When he's talking about sexual sin, I was like, well, that felt like a hard right turn. But if we actually come to believe that the reward in our brain, that this stimulus is necessary for survival, it starts to act like the way we feel about food. You can actually get to the point where you believe that this sort of stimulation is necessary for your own survival, or more correctly, what I think actually happens is it gets so normal to go to that stimulation that you're willing to do it almost at any point. On that same flight back from San Francisco, it was really interesting to me. About 4 rows up and across the aisle from where I was sitting, there was a young guy, probably in his mid-20s, watching porn right there on the plane, on his tablet. This was an overnight flight. Almost everybody else was asleep. But it just struck me as odd. It wasn't just a casual movie, an R-rated movie. He was actually watching porn with headphones right there on the plane in plain view. And I see people shaking their heads like they can't believe it. But apparently he watched it so much that it became normal. It became something he did when he was bored, when he wanted to be excited, when just to breathe. This is how our brain gets rewired, and this is why Paul tells us and brings up food. We need to actually understand that rewiring our brains in this way will actually cause us to see illicit activity and sexual sin as something as necessary as food. But Paul doesn't leave us there. He actually then transitions and says, but God's stronger. He's got power over this. He has the power to control this, to destroy this. And I'm a dad of quite a few years, so I have all kinds of little cliches and easy things to say there. So I just want to kind of reference that even if you're in the middle of this heavy sexual sin, or you're caught, that God has the power to save you from the penalty of your sin. That's salvation. He will save you from the power of sin. That's saving us from the sins that we're actively committing. And ultimately, He will save us from the presence of sin. That's my pastoral 3 alliterations there. I had to get that. Okay. So as we think about this, what does this really mean in our lives? So let's go back to the very top of the passage, and it says, and let's go to the next slide, guys. All things are lawful. I thought this was kind of an interesting way, and I'm sorry, I didn't have a chance to check the text size. If it's too small, come forward. There's lots of sense. All right, Paul starts off with saying that all things are lawful. But we just heard about how terrible some of these things are. Why did Paul not give us a prescriptive list? I thought it was interesting that he says all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. And I think it's because human nature, we want a list. We want a checklist. Well, if I don't do this, and I do this, and I go to church twice a week, and I serve over here, I won't have a problem. But it's not really that. Paul could have given us a checklist. Under the power of the Holy Spirit, I'm sure that there was some magic or algorithmic formula that he could have given us, but he didn't. Why? Because I think that sexual sin is unique to every single individual. You know, growing up, you hear things in the church, you hear things like, well, the first look's God's, the second look's the devil's. Hey, I can watch an R-rated movie because I'm an adult, and I'm able to say that, I'm able to withstand that. But you may not be able to. I can have a phone at 12. Maybe you can't. Because we need to actually understand that our Christian life is one of personal responsibility. I don't think Paul was overly prescriptive at the very start of that passage, because I don't think that he wanted us to think that one answer would solve it for everybody. He wants all of us to wrestle with this sin and to come to terms with it ourselves. He wants that sense of personal responsibility. So let's move on to another related passage, because Paul says all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. Now I'd like somebody else to pop up and read Romans 6:23. And if you have this one memorized, a lot of us who grew up in church probably know this one off the tops of our heads. Romans 6:23.
For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Oh, sorry, for the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Jesus Christ our Lord.
Both of great verses.
They relied on my Bible.
The wages of sin are death. We gloss over this one really fast. Death is a tricky, hard subject for me. I was at a funeral of a really good friend this past week, just a couple days ago, and it reminded me that life is really short. But when Paul says that the wages of sin are death, I don't think that he really means that it's always a literal personal death. It can certainly lead that. Disease, bad judgment can certainly lead directly to a physical and direct death. But I think that there's a lot of types of death that come with sexual sin. I think that there could be death of the relationship with your spouse. There could be loss of relationship with your children. Loss of income, jobs, and career. There could be then the sickness. So when we think about the wages of sin are death, and then Paul telling us that all things are lawful, those verses are connected. Yes, God has already saved us. Yes, the wages of sin are death. And it doesn't have to be a literal death. If you're 19, 20 years old, I can see how it could be really, really hard to think about sin leading directly to death. But, like the young man that I was talking about earlier, that baggage of his sin he carried into his marriage. His wife loves him. She was concerned, scared, and hurt because of what he brought into the marriage. It came dangerously close to destroying their marriage. Not because they didn't want to be married, but because she couldn't figure out why she wasn't enough. We think of sexual sin as being a private sin. We see sexual sin as something that I handle myself. So let's talk a few things about sin and the way it's working in our lives. I don't really believe in coincidence, and I'm going to say a few things that might be a little charged. So again, this is where I'm going to take a left turn. If you don't like it, talk to BJ. But it's very interesting to me that the result of the sexual revolution in the 60s and early 70s was what? What was the big event that came right out of that? Roe v. Wade and the legalization of abortion. Millions, not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, not hundreds, millions of babies were killed in the name of sexual freedom. Just struck me as really odd that death came very fast to that. Very, very fast. Fast forward to the last couple of years. And this is where I think I could be way off the reservation, so just be mad at BJ. It's interesting to me that when it looked like our culture was just going to, hey, live and let live the transgender movement, the very first thing that came after that was an assault on our children. It was instant. It wasn't even the 5 or 6 years later. It was immediate. I have a guy that I work with. He's would identify himself as a homosexual. He and his partner married in the Pacific Northwest. They adopted a little girl, a baby. He was talking in an open forum at work not too long ago about how he already saw signs of gender dysphoria in his 2-year-old little girl. You're in a work meeting. You can't roll your eyes. You can't, thankfully I was on Zoom, so I could off camera myself. But just think about the culture where, of course, the 2-year-old little girl is showing signs of wanting to act like a little boy. The two most important people in her lives are male. I raised 3 girls. It's pretty normal for them to want to play with cars and to ride bikes and to climb trees because they're people. They're adventuresome little people, but it was really, really interesting how all of this warps our brains. The sexual sin actually changes our brain and makes it okay. So I wonder today what we're okay with. If I looked at your phones, what would you be okay with? If I looked at your streaming history, what are you okay with? I saw a few sideline glances there. Your streaming history kind of give you guys away a little bit. But why? Because it's become normal. It's become easy. And it's become so pervasive, we just glance right past it. So I'm going to reference a book by Steve Gallagher, and I don't know if you guys know who Steve Gallagher is. He was the founder and original leader of Pure Life Ministries. But he describes this, what he calls the death spiral. And we're going to go through this a little bit. So if you could go to the dominion slide, guys. And Paul talks about this in the verses he goes, I will not be dominated by anything. And this is important. We've just established that sexual sin can become so pervasive and so involved that it actually feels necessary. We've talked about how this blows relationships apart and creates nuclear levels of damage. And yet, I'd be willing to bet in a room this size, there is somebody who looked at something sexually explicit in the last 48 hours or less. Because the math says that it happened. So when we talk about what sin does in our lives, the very first thing it does is it causes us to not give gratitude to God. It causes us to not be reverent and understand the gift that God's given us. And we talked a little bit about this already, but it's really hard. Why does Paul talk about hanging out with prostitutes and taking Christ with you? Just for a second, would you pay a prostitute to come to church with you? Anybody? Be an interesting way to witness to somebody, I suppose. But we also learn from the way the neurotransmitters in your brain work that it darkens your heart. Your inner sense of failure leads to worse failures. It becomes progressively bad. Those studies went on to say that people who get into pornography experience deeper and deeper and more twisted forms of pornography, leading ultimately to forms of violence. I was, again, just noodling that, and I spend a lot of time in airports as I travel fairly often. Coming through the Austin airport here just about a month ago, there are signs everywhere about stopping human trafficking. Why is human trafficking a big problem all of a sudden? And it really got me noodling about it. The only reason people do things is they get something out of it. And kidnapping and slavery and things have been problems from the beginning, but why the uptick? And I went and did a little research, and it turns out that it isn't just our awareness of human trafficking that has increased recently, but it's actually up by 300-400% of reported incidents of human trafficking. Just in this country alone. All right. Being the naturally curious person I am, what are they doing with people? Me personally, I can barely keep track of the people that I'm supposed to, much less go find other people. What are they doing with them? It turns out that a very large portion get put into the porn industry, into the sexually illicit trades. It isn't just about kidnapping, but the reason it has exploded is because these folks are then drugged or whatever, or treated poorly, or even just taught from a very young age that this is normal, and are brought into this lifestyle. So what does our addiction to pornography and sexual illicit behavior, it directly correlates to the death of this person's life, their lifestyle. If you talk to somebody who's come out of the sex industry, their life is irrevocably changed. God is a big God. He will turn what is ashes into diamonds, but it doesn't change the fact that that person went through an ash stage. I can tell you right now that it's really, really not fun to have your life burned down to the ashes. All right, number 3, suppression of truth. This doesn't hurt anybody. We just talked about that. It's victimless. That young guy on the plane watching pornography on the plane doesn't hurt anybody. It's just TV. What about your browsing histories? What about how you treat each other when you're dating? It's victimless, right? It carries into your relationships. It's never victimless. Sin is never, ever, ever victimless. When Paul says it's a sin against your own body, that's true. But we are connected. We are one body. I am a believer in the phrase that more lies are told in the lobby of a church than any other place in the world. How are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. No, you're not. How are things going? Things good? Yeah, they're okay. No, they're not. I mean, it could be. But I'm sure that even today, several folks in this room said, yeah, things are good. And they're not. They're hiding. They're suppressing the truth. Finally, God gives us over to the lust of our heart. This means that even as a Christian, you stop wondering what God thinks about it because you start rationalizing. I'm going to seek this out. I'm going to run hard after it. God's like any other parent. There is a point where you can't hold your kids back. And I'm speaking as a parent of some adult kids. You can't hold them back. You teach them as best you can. You hope that your mistakes don't really rub off too badly on them. I had this conversation with all three of my adult girls. Hey, you learned about the mistakes your mom and I made. Please make new ones. And you know what? Every single one of them, all three of them, looked me square in the eye because I had this conversation with each of them. Well, we know that you guys made mistakes, but it'll turn out different for me. Young people, it doesn't. It just doesn't. Make your own sinful mistakes that are new, but don't make the ones we know about already. Finally, you get given over in general. You become the guy who's willing to watch porn on a plane right in front of everybody. Because you do it so often, it's normal. Then finally, you have a reprobate mind. You actually, you talk about, you see these folks who have really wonderful lives, and you learn, why does that guy have an Ashley Madison or Grindr or Tinder? I don't know the social media sites for such things these days. But why do they have these sites? You see a guy who's an upstanding member of his community or a girl, and he was just busted with thousands of images on his computer. How does he get there? He gets there because his mind has become darkened. It's become incredibly normal. Oh, he was raised in the church. Yeah. Sexual sin touches every single one of us. And finally, ultimately, you're filled with unrighteousness. This doesn't mean that you've lost your salvation, because you can't. But it does mean that you can have your heart so darkened with some form of sin that you will chase after it so hard that God will be a very distant light in the back of your mind. Until it all blows apart. And it will. Because God will not allow our sin to be private for forever. If I ask you to raise your hands and say, hey, I know of a person, or it was me, that got caught up in sexual sin, I wonder how many arms of people would actually be raised. How many people went further dating than they really planned to? I was raised in the church. I'm a Christian. I believe in God. I knew this was wrong. But on some level, I wanted to. Or it had become so normalized for me that I couldn't stand it, and I just wanted to be a part of it. So as we sort of make the last turn here, I'm going to try to end a few seconds early. We're going to move on to the last slide about fleeing from sexual sin. Because I think that's really interesting. Paul doesn't say walk away. He doesn't say, hey, let's amble away. He said flee. The actual word means run past, to get away, not to look back, not to hesitate, don't pass, don't collect $200, just go. How many folks would be willing to leave their phones in the pews as they walk out of the building today? How many people would turn off their Apple TVs or their Chromecasts right now? Because they said, you know what, this is a vector in my life that I have absolutely no control over. How many parents, and I'm speaking to my own self when I say this, haven't looked at their kids' phones and browser histories in the last couple of weeks or months or ever? How are you speaking into your kids' lives about this? What do you do with, because again, I've made every possible mistake. I've tried every combination of software, of checking, but you can't. You can't white knuckle sexual sin. And you can't protect everyone perfectly. You give somebody a direct shunt into the internet, they're going to use it even by accident. I was reading an article about another young lady who misspelled something and got dropped into a set of videos and she just clicked on them when she was 8. How many people have misspelled something into a search engine and gotten some videos they did not expect to get? How many people then clicked? How many 6, 7, 8-year-olds wouldn't click? I have a 5-year-old. He's the most curious person I've ever met. He'll click on anything. And I'm utterly terrified about what we're going to do. Because I've made every single mistake with phones and devices. I have been incredibly prideful. I can protect my kids. I can build all the security I want to. And it's true, it just doesn't help. Because their friend can hand them a phone. Or you yourself. It's Thursday night. It's 9 o'clock. Your spouse is at a meeting. Nobody's going to know that you watched that extremely racy movie or pornography because you're home by yourself. Not a single person's ever going to know. But remember that spiral, it's going to pull you down deeper. So I'm going to talk to those folks that have this sin in their life right now. Because somebody in the room does. Somebody's marriage is currently being blown apart because of sin. Somebody's relationship is about to be irrevocably damaged because they're going to carry sin into it. Somebody is dealing with the scars and pain of having been affected by this. When you're caught in this type of sin, the very first thing that you do is hide it. Because you say, I'm a Christian, I can white knuckle my way through this. And I'd be willing to bet, and I've done this myself, all right, God, I start bargaining. I'm going to get up every morning at 6. I'm going to read my Bible a chapter every day. I am going to have a prayer journal. I am going to read, some sort of daily devotion. I am going to go to church 4 times a week. I'm going to keep my pastor on speed dial. I'm going to keep my youth minister on speed dial. I'm going to get 4 accountability partners. I'm going to wrap my life in rules. Because I'm going to hide my sin. Because I'm going to white knuckle my way through it. Let me just tell each and every one of you, it won't work. It simply won't. I'm not saying those things are bad things. I would encourage all of you to do many of those things. But don't for a second think that it's going to keep sin out of your life. You cannot straitjacket yourself enough that something won't happen. And because of that spiral that we talked about, domination, when you white knuckle and wrap yourself in those rules and you fall, and you will fall again, you will fall harder and further than you expected. And then you will feel more guilt and shame. And you will want it to be more private. And you'll do it again. Or this time you might reach out and say, hey, I'm going to talk to a Christian brother. I'm going to talk to somebody not in my church, not my small group, maybe not a close friend, but somebody who I can feel like I confess to, who will give me some platitudes or maybe give me a little bit of advice, and I talk to them about once every 3 or 4 months, a couple times a year. And I'm going to wrap myself around that, and it's going to work for a little while. And then it won't. And every time it doesn't work, it gets worse. This will happen. So how do we resolve this? Point number 2, you're not alone. There is not a sin in this room committed by any person in this room, or they have been affected by a sin by someone else in this room, that the elders, the pastors, I'm happy to talk to you, that cannot be shared because God is not on that cross any longer. He's simply not. So if you find yourself caught in an addictive sin, if you find yourself in a dominating sin, do not hide it. Remember, you were bought at a great price. The heir apparent to the throne of creation came down. He could have wiped this out with a word, with a thought, and he didn't. Why? Because he would have done so for any of us. Remember that very first poster I saw? I wake up in the mornings and I feel like that sinking ship. I go to bed a lot of times at night thinking about that sinking ship, because it never leaves my mind very far about how far I blew it, about how badly I affected my life and my marriage, about how much grace was poured out on me specifically. My wife is sitting right there. She sits with me every week in church. Well, I'm not sound booth, but we serve together, we worship together, and it's now been almost 15 years to the day. God's an amazingly strong God, and we literally have the word community in our title of our church, in the name of our church. Do not leave the room today with dominating sin in your life that you're not sharing with someone, because we will walk through fire with you. Bring it into the light and let it be burned up by the glory of God. He's already paid the price for it. He's asking us not to do it any longer. So as we trend, because I think, right at the right time, I'm going to ask the worship team to come on up and I'm going to pray. But I really appreciate everybody letting me share today. And we will talk about temptation in a couple months when we get to 1 Corinthians 10. I know this was a heavy and weighty topic. And if you want to come pray, I'll be standing down front. The elders are spread around the room. They'll pray with you. But do not leave this room today if you feel like you need to talk to somebody. Thank you.